One of the biggest issues I run into with running a business is finding qualified people to work in my business. One of the main issues is the lack of the ability to use the intellect and reason to solve problems. They typically want to be given the answer or knowledge to solve the problems. They do not know how to create ideas and deduce answers. They tend to only seek sensory knowledge, but sensory knowledge itself is meaningless unless a person can use the sensory knowledge to produce intellectual knowledge and use reason to deduce possible answers and conclusions and grow in experience. Hello everyone, today's episode is about the intellect, the faculty that makes us uniquely the image and likeness of God and separates us from animals. I am going to discuss what is the intellect, how it operates, and then give practical real-world wisdom on how to use the intellect from problem solving and risk management.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Cease. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins at Marine OCS. So one of the things that they do is they kind of grade you, and they grade you in leadership, in physical capability, and then the third is intellectual capability. So one of the ways that they do that is this part of OCS called the REACT course. Now, this REACT course probably emphasizes all three aspects, and it's a big part of your grade. It's part of your leadership grade, which is pretty much like 60% of the grade. It also tests your physical capabilities as well as your intellectual capabilities. So what is this REACT course? So the REACT course is this big fenced area. And within that fenced area, it's all covered in secrecy because within there are, I believe, anywhere from 5 to 8 problems that need to be solved in there, and they don't want it to be shown because you can start studying and analyzing those problems. So what typically happens is they send in 4 candidates through every time, so that, and then one person has a chance to be the leader to come up with the solution and then execute that solution amongst the other 3 candidates. It was basically my turn, all right? And how it works is that we constantly had to run to the REACT course, so you get pretty tired after running. And the REACT course, I believe, was about 2 miles away from where we were. But you got to remember, it's 2 miles there and 2 miles back, and all 4 of us have to take turns doing this. Plus, we're doing other things. So you're physically, it's physically demanding because you're running, you're doing all these other things. So that's how the physical component goes in. And then the intellectual part comes in the part that you are trying to solve this problem. And then the leadership comes in because you're trying to execute this. The problem that I have to solve, you're in a room where only that you can see at first as a leader. And it's 2 stories high. There's this window at 2 stories high. And I have to get this ammo can. And the ammo can probably weighs about maybe 30 to 40 pounds. And I have to get it to that second floor. And there's no ladders. The only thing that I can use is this big, long steel pole. It's very heavy and it's very long. Then they say to you, everything that is painted in red, if you touch it, you're dead. Or we used to say, red is dead. So, and when you look at what you're looking at, almost everything is red. So you can't even get close to the wall. You can't get close to anything. So, you look at it, and I came up with the conclusion that the way that I'm going to solve this problem is I'm going to take this big steel pole and put it, lean it against the window, all right? And then what I was going to do is I was going to pile, we were going to create like a human ladder, right? But using the pole to lean against and to support us. And then each one of us would then, move the ammo can on top of each other. So we're making this human ladder. So I have this plan, I execute it. I talk to the other 3 candidates, so they're like, good to go. We go execute it. The first man goes on there. He leans against we get the pole that leans it against the window. We then have the first candidate, he's laying down. The second candidate is climbing on top of him and standing on his shoulders. When the third candidate goes up and tries to climb on that, he falls down, right? I mean, it was pretty bad. I mean, he fell down, and I think he almost got injured himself. And mind you, we have only about 5 or 10 minutes to not only, get the idea, but then to explain the idea to the other candidates, then to execute it. So it's not a lot of time. So as I see these candidates falling, I realize, oh my goodness, my idea is not going to work, and it's failing right now. And my mind goes completely blank. I can't even think of any other ideas. I'm fairly nervous. I'm thinking I'm going to fail this whole course. And so one of the candidates says, well, David, if we do this, this, and this, then, I think we can do it, get that ammo can up there. By this time, I'm kind of like at wit's end, and I'm like, all right, go ahead. Let's try to see if we can do this. And so we're just about to execute the second plan that the other candidate had when our instructor says, time. So now I'm completely nervous at the fact that I probably failed, okay? And this is about, 60% of the leadership grade. So I go there, and the instructor says, well, I gave you a 97. I'm like in total shock that I got a 97. And he says, that was excellent. You were able to come up with the idea. You kept your composure when it failed. You were able to listen to your other candidates' input and those ideas. So what I thought was going to be a great tragedy became, honestly, a very good, a grade. And so I ran out of there, and I was very happy with the grade that I got. But problem solving, because of a lot of technology and knowledge and Google and everything else, a lot of, especially young kids coming out of college, they do not have problem-solving skills. Simple problem-solving skills. They want to be spoon-fed the answers. So today, I'm going to talk about the intellect, because this is where, where problem-solving comes along. And so today's topic is about the intellect. This topic of the intellect will span multiple episodes. It might be 2 or 3, with the other episodes discussing how to use the intellect in our prayer life, specifically in meditation, in discernment, okay? And when I say discernment, it's not just vocations here in discernment. I'm also talking about, does discern even, simple things in business. I use discernment a lot. Self-reflection. How do we use the intellect and self-reflection? And what can go wrong with our intellect, and what hinders us from using the intellect, and how to overcome it. So this is why it's going to span multiple episodes. So let's begin with Genesis, okay? And the reason why I begin with Genesis is because there's something uniquely important to understand about the intellect and the will. They kind of go hand in hand with each other. Last episode, I talked about the will. In fact, it was 2 episodes. So now we're going to talk about the intellect. And the reason why I want to start out with Genesis is because I want to show what makes us the image and likeness of God. So if you go to Genesis, all right, there's these accounts of creation. There's basically 2 accounts of creation. So I want to talk about the more in-depth account where it's about, 6 days of creation. And a lot of times we get wrapped around the scientific aspect of creation, which we shouldn't be so wrapped around that, right? We need to be understanding that the book about creation has a lot of symbolism in there. And if we can glean and really get at the symbolism, we'll understand Genesis a lot better, okay? Now, I'm not trying to pit Genesis against science, because science and religion don't compete with each other. They're actually very symbiotic with each other. But let's talk about it in light of the symbolism, right? So, one of the things that we have to understand is that the separation of day and night, okay, light and darkness, I should say, there's a lot of symbolism in there, but try to understand that creation between the separation of day and light, as well as the stars and the moons, represent time, okay? I just did the Liturgy of the Hours last night, and it was great because, why are the moons so important? Because it breaks the months. In the Psalm, it says that. You give us the moon to give us the months. What's a day? A day is the Earth's revolution between daylight and nightlight, okay? What's a year? But the revolving of the Earth around the sun. So it represents time, all right? And then the separation of water, the upper water, the lower water, the creation of the land and the waters. What does that represent? Space. It represents space and location, all right? And then the last, where Genesis talks about the birds and the land creatures, the creepy things, that represents life. That's what it represents. So the three basic things that we need is time, space and location, and life. And why? But if you notice, there's a specific order in the way that it does these things. And the last creature to be created is man, human beings. And it's almost like saying God is providing this nice place for us, okay? And that the world is really for us as human beings. Now, the orderliness is important because the apex of creation is man. Man is the apex of that creation. So why is he the apex of that creation? Because just like mammals, we are just like mammals, right? And sometimes we just, scientists who are atheists reduce us just to be like animals, right? But we're not, because there's one thing, okay, that we have that is not common to all the other animals, and that is a spiritual soul. And why is it so spiritual? Because we have an intellect and a will, all right? This is so important to understand the distinguishment between other animals, even though we are very similar, very, very similar. One of the symbolism of Adam naming all the animals was the fact that, Adam could discern that, unlike all of the bears and the hippopotamuses and everything else, they're not like me. They're not like me. So God created Eve to complement Adam. So animals, even though they mimic like we do, we have one thing, and that is the intellect and the will. And that intellect and the will can make us, evil or holy. You see, animals, just like animals, we are good by nature, right? Animals are good by nature, but they can't be holy and they can't be evil. Certainly they can do evil things, but because we can train them to do it, but by nature, they just can't, be evil and they can't become holy, all right? But man, by nature, is good, but because of the intellect and will, it could be evil, right? Or it could be holy, because that's what it can strive for, all right, through the intellect and will. It can unite its intellect and will to God's intellect and will, and ascend to the intellectual level to God, and unite its will to God. That's our mission, and that's what we need to do, and that's what makes us holy. Or we can use our intellect and will for selfish purposes, okay, and then use that to do evil things, okay, evil acts. So today we're going to focus on the intellect. Last two episodes, we talked about the will, right? So, and we know that the will is dependent on the intellect because the intellect is what perceives the good and the bad, or what is good. So here's something that man's intellect allows us to do. And this is so important because remember, animals can't do this. We can. The first thing that the intellect does is allows us to self-reflect. Okay? Self-reflection. Why is that so important? Well, because self-reflection is what allows us to improve. I was talking to a person, I said, animals, let's look at the bees, for example. The bees of today and the bees 5,000 years ago were doing the exact same thing. And that is produce honey, create wax, and live as a community. They haven't deviated. They haven't changed. They haven't increased their knowledge. They do the same thing. But man can self-reflect. We as human beings can self-reflect and improve ourselves. This is why we went from walking to riding a horse to creating chariots to creating cars to creating planes, and then maybe in the future creating something else. But we can self-reflect and improve ourselves. All right? We can meditate and unite our intellect with God and think of higher ideas. All right? And we have imagination to build on those ideas. That's how that's how we're able to progress in life. All right? So it's not like, we're not like animals, because the animals of today, those same animals did the same thing back 5,000 years ago. There was no progress. We have a memory to store good and bad thoughts and ideas and build on those thoughts and ideas. Okay? We can problem solve. We can solve problems. This is how we are able to progress in technology. All right? So let's think of it one thing. They say that, what do they say? They say necessity is the mother of all inventions. Why is that? Because necessity says we have to problem solve. All right? And that's why we're so adaptable. We can understand physical concepts. All right? Physical concept means here concepts that are here in the physical world. We can understand spiritual concepts, such as math, right? Such as love, patriotism, hate, fear. We can actually understand these spiritual concepts. So, and we can create a society that deals with love. We can give up our life for love or patriotism. That's why we have soldiers. Soldiers are out there, defending our country. And they're really not getting paid a lot of money for what they do, which is risking their lives. All right? We have fear that prevents us from doing things. Right? Can you imagine if all the bees started getting afraid? And they're like, oh, I can't get honey anymore. So those are spiritual concepts. And then lastly, we can be enlightened by grace and unite our intellect with God's intellect. This is the highest capability, highest purpose of our intellect. All right? Outside of providing the needs of our world and progressing to help others of our intellect, the highest one is uniting our intellect with God and using that for a purpose. So this intellect allows us to do many, many things as human beings. So what is this intellect? And this is so important to understand what the intellect is. The reason why is because, as a person who was, did a lot of athletics, I played football, I did wrestling, to be a great athlete, you have to understand your body. You have to understand how to make it stronger, how to utilize the different parts of your body. Especially as wrestlers, wrestling really taught me how to really use my arms, my legs against my opponent. You'd be surprised how leverage, momentum, strength, weaknesses all combine together to be a good wrestler or an excellent wrestler. So by understanding a key component of your body will make you better. By understanding the intellect and how it works, we can know what we're leveraging, what we're not leveraging, and then improve in our process. So think of the intellect as just these various components. And a lot of times people rely on one component over the other, and they don't rely on the other parts of the intellect. And so they don't fully grow and fully they grow in their potential. All right. So after we talk about this, I'm going to then show you a real life application of it, what I call problem solving and risk management. All right. How to understand risk and using the various parts of the intellect. So let's talk about it, right? So the first thing that is important to understand is the intellect has several components. All right, it's kind of like the CPU. Yeah, I'm a very much of a geeky person because I'm an IT guy, but you can almost relate the intellect to being kind of like the CPU. The CPU is the brains of a computer. It stands for the central processing unit. All right, and that's what the intellect is in many cases, the CPU. But a lot of people don't realize that the CPU actually consists of multiple innards. And it's not just this one little, processor, and that's what it does. So the first component of the intellect is the imagination. This bridges the knowledge from our body to our soul. I'm going to use Father Marin's definitions. Father Marin is a great theologian. He taught at the Angelicum back in the 50s and the 60s. I believe he passed away in the early 2000s. But very, very good Dominican, I'll call him. So I'm going to quote some parts of his book. It's excellent in there. So Father Marin, the imagination is a very important faculty when one considers the intimate relationship between the soul and the body. Every idea acquired by the natural operation of our faculties corresponds to a previous image which the imagination offered to the intellect. What he's saying here is basically our intellect is important because our imagination is what allows us to get the sensory knowledge, okay? The sensory ideas. Sensory here means our five senses: hearing, touch, taste, sight, all right? So it's those that we get our ideas from, all right? So this is called sensory knowledge. So it's that part of our soul that bridges that gap between the body and our soul. Without images, the intellect cannot know naturally, okay? So in other words, if we don't have images that comes from our senses. Now, images aren't deduced. When we say images, we're not just talking strictly pictures, okay? We're talking about conceptual images like parables and stories, as well as sensory, reading books. Books aren't really pictures, but you can picture that through reading, okay? So when we say images here, we're not talking just about pictures, all right, or seeing, things out there. It also means what we're reading or what we're listening to when people talk about ideas. So, because all of those comes from the outside world and is being fed through our imagination. So, in other words, we can't, the intellect cannot know naturally without images, okay? Continuing with Father Martin, for that reason, the use of sensible images is important for teaching abstract ideas and speculative principles, especially to the young and uneducated, who without the sensible aid would not be able to understand them. Our Lord continually made use of the imagination to place the great mysteries within the understanding of the simple and faithful people by means of his beautiful parables and allegories. The imagination also has a great influence over the sensitive appetite, which is moved with a great impetus toward its proper object when the imagination clothes it with special attractions. So what it's basically saying is the main roles of the imagination is to get the sensory input, sensory knowledge, sensory ideas, meaning all these things from our senses, what we hear, what we read, okay, what we see visually, what we touch. It gets all that knowledge, and it needs it because the intellect can't understand naturally without these images, without these. It's important to understand that everything, when we see movies, right? It might, like the movie like Aliens, right? I'm kind of dating myself, but the movie Aliens, it might look like, wow, that's a fantastic image, like that we thought of everything. No, those people who directed and made that movie Aliens understood, okay, are all based off of common knowledge of animals, right? So basically, in the movie Aliens, it's these aliens that kind of take over bodies and all this other stuff. Well, that's just a parasite. That's the idea, the concept of a parasite. Okay, and it had blood that can it was acidic, right? Well, that's a concept of the acid blood comes from the idea of of acids. So the people can't create out of nothing. They have to have this image of something. And then they can use their imagination to then extrapolate that and extend that idea. But it can never create out of nothing, okay? So it has to get this external part. The other thing it can do, the imagination, is that it can imagine and extrapolate what these ideas are, okay? Which we call imagination, right? Or phantasms that that sometimes it's called. So that's the other thing it can do. But when it does that, sometimes our imagination can clothe our sensory images to something that we're attracted to. All right? So that then leads us to go after it. Okay? So, for example, I can know about my wife, all right, and know a lot about her from my senses. But then I can imagine her as this wonderful, beautiful person, all right? And now I'm attracted to her, okay? And now I want to lead to go and see her and date her and marry her, all right? And that's, in the later episodes, we're going to talk about how dangerous that is as well, because our imaginations with, not being controlled can lead us to bad things, Maybe it's vainglory, maybe it's thinking about other women, okay? This is where lust can come into play, all right? And doing that. So that's the role of our imagination, all right? And that's part of this world called the intellect. The next part we've got in the intellect is called the memory, all right? And the memory stores two types of things. One is the sensitive memory, all right? The sensitive part of the memory is the part that remembers the sensory parts of our knowledge. And remember, sensitive part comes from our imaginations, all right? It comes from there, and anything that is there is stored in our sensory part. The next part of the memory is our intellectual memory. And intellectual memory, when we say intellectual here, is that part of the intellect can do is it can deduce, make judgments, and have these ideas from our intellect. And that needs to be stored. So, for example, 2 + 2 = 4. That's an intellectual part of our memory. When we deduce certain judgments, if I do X, if I do Y, and I have C, all right, then that's going to be stored in our intellectual memory. So we can deduce certain things, All right, and we'll talk about that through the intellect, okay? So sensitive memory as opposed to intellectual memory. That's what's going to be stored there. So let's read about that, all right? So the next is the intellect of in itself, the CPU, the processing unit, all right? And I want to read, all right, the part where Father Maran describes the difference between sensitive knowledge and intellectual knowledge, because this is very, very important, because a lot of people emphasize sensitive knowledge but not intellectual knowledge. And let's read what the difference is. The intellect is the faculty of the soul by which we apprehend things in an immaterial way. It's important. We apprehend or comprehend things in an immaterial way. Its proper effect is the idea which it abstracts from external objects by means of the phantasm of the imagination, which is illumined by the abstract power of the intellect itself, called in psychology the ancient intellect. So one of the byproducts of knowledge, or one of the things that we get from knowledge, are ideas. This is the emphasis, ideas, okay? Ideas we get from the external senses, just direct ideas. You know, in other words, like my wife gives me an idea. David, I think you should do this. That's an idea. But then the imagination can extrapolate. We can use our imagination, produce other ideas. So we're not just limited to ideas from our external world. We can produce ideas, okay, through our imagination. This is key to understand, all right? This is key, all right? Because a lot of people fail to understand that, all right? That one of the worst things that the world here in America, what we do is we limit our imagination a lot of times to the level of creativeness, which is usually either drawing or building these great, fantastic, buildings, right? And it's very limited to that. Imagination is really artistic imagination, and that's what we've reduced it to. But you see, imagination can also be used for problem solving, everyday problem solving, and we'll show you that, okay? It can also be used in meditation. In fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church says imagination should be used, okay, in meditation. That's the only way you can use it, all right? I mean, Jesus is teaching us a parable. He's using our imagination to talk about that. So the imagination allows us to come up with other ideas that we don't need to have, other people give us ideas, and we can even extrapolate on the ideas of other people through our imagination. So important to understand, ideas which it abstracts from external objects by means of the phantasm of the imagination. All right? Intellectual knowledge is completely distinct and infinitely superior to the knowledge of the senses. Okay? So these ideas that are created through our imagination, okay, through our, imagining things, right, are superior than the sensory knowledge. All right? So we have our sensory knowledge, which is the point blank ideas that come from the outside sensory world. They could either be ideas that someone has given us, it could be what we're seeing, it could be all these, but they're sensory ideas that are giving us sensory knowledge. Okay, that's what it's basically giving us. As opposed to intellectual knowledge, all right, which is giving us where we're deducing through imagination, all right, this idea of ideas, all right. So, and we talked about there. So we're talking about, so now let's talk about what Father Maran continues. He says, sensitive knowledge always refers to singular, concrete, and determined objects, while the knowledge through ideas, the object of the intellectual knowledge, all right? So ideas are the object of the intellectual knowledge. I apologize, I might have said. Ideas from the external senses are people who are giving you those ideas, right? But we can deduce our own ideas through our imagination, all right, through the intellectual knowledge. And he's saying is this object of intellectual knowledge is always universal, abstract, and undetermined. We possess sensitive knowledge in common with the animals, but intellectual knowledge is proper and exclusive to intellectual beings, which are God, the angels, and man. So what makes us uniquely godlike, angel-like, is this intellectual knowledge, this ability to get ideas through the intelligence. All right? So just to kind of summarize this concept, we've got images that come through our senses. Our imagination process those. We use phantasms to produce ideas. Those ideas is what makes up what we call intellectual knowledge, as opposed to sensory knowledge, which is knowledge of just the external outside world. We could get ideas from external world when someone tells us those ideas, but we're not creating our own ideas, through the senses. Very important to understand, because later on, when we talk about problem solving, when we talk about meditation, when we talk about self-reflection, we're going to use that part of our intellect to come up with the lots of ideas, all right? And that's where a lot of people fail. So the other part that the intellect does, all right, so that's one thing, is to create these ideas through our imagination and help us control that. But the other part that the intellect does is that it helps us make judgments so that we can to create reason, to be reasonable, right? Man with reason, and then come to deductive reasoning. So let's read what Father Morin says. He says, when the intellect compares two ideas and affirms or denies something about them, it pronounces a judgment. That's what we call a judgment. So we have these two ideas, all right, that affirms or denies, we call that a judgment. If it compares two judgments in order to conclude a third judgment, it performs an act of reasoning. So basically what we're doing is we're saying, I'm affirming or denying these two ideas. We call them a judgment. But then when we have two judgments and we do it in order, then we call that third judgment an act of reasoning. That's what man can do. Man can reason through various judgments. This is true. This is false. This true coupled with this true will produce this other truth. And then he says that explicit reasoning, all right, these multiple reasoning in the form which we have just given is called a syllogism, all right, or deductive reasoning. We have the ability to make judgments. Judgments make an act of the reason, called reasoning, which then creates deductive reasoning. So what does that mean? I'll give you an idea. If we were to say all animals have four legs, all right, if we were to say that, all animals have four legs, and we we make a judgment that says that, we say, I agree, all animals have four legs. Then it says, then we say dogs are animals, right? So I say, again, all right, you're right, a dog is an animal. So I made judgment on those two ideas. All animals have four legs, that's true. Then the other truth I say is dogs are animals. I put them together, all right, and I can say, and I can deduce this and create what they call a syllogism and say, then dogs have 4 legs. Because of those 2 truths, I can say dogs have 4 legs. Because if all animals have 4 legs and a dog is an animal, then I can deduce that animal is, the dog has 4 legs. Okay? And that's called a syllogism, or what we call deductive reasoning. That's what we can do. And this is important to understand, because when we use the faculty of reason, when we look at our intellect, we're going to be able to use it to reason. And we're going to discuss this when we go further down to problem solving. Okay? So we can have a multitude of aspects surrounding our ideas, right, that then allows us to kind of deduce these ideas to a logical end. All right? That's what we can do. So the 2 aspects of the intellect it does, it creates ideas through the imagination. It uses those ideas to create judgments. Multiple judgments creates reasoning, and multiple reasoning, explicit reasoning, creates what we call syllogisms or deductive reasoning. Okay? So now, let's talk about, Father Martin says something that's very profound here, okay? And it's about what the intellect can do. The intellect is very delicate and subtle in discovering almost without effort a multitude of aspects surrounding an idea. This is so amazing. The intellect can surround itself and understand lots of things about an idea. In other words, we can compound an idea into more ideas, into more things. All right? It's kind of like a nuclear explosion, right? You got one idea that can, and we can analyze that idea and we can extrapolate on that idea, all right, through our imagination. So it's not like we're just fixated on one part of the idea. We can surround and understand everything about that idea. All right, and I'm going to show you why that's important when it comes to problem solving. It is profound in analyzing and dividing into its ultimate element some concrete notions. So another thing he's saying that the intellect can do is not only can we imagine these things, but we can start creating profound concrete notions. We can then conclude from one idea that's creating another idea to concrete conclusions, right? And again, I'm going to talk about how we can apply that to problem solving and risk management in real life, all right? So understanding this is what our intellect can do, all right? So not only can it do aspects of understanding ideas and create multiple ideas and all the surrounding ideas and extrapolate on those ideas and multiple ideas, well, we can also analyze and create more notions based off of those ideas and say, yeah, if this is happening, then we can conclude that this is going to happen, right? It is, so continue with Father Martin, it is solid if it is able to reason things out by logical deduction based upon certain principles. It has foresight if from past events or present events, it can deduce by means of an acute observation what will happen in the future. So what it's saying is, by using our of all these ideas and conclusions and everything, we can actually have foresight, right? Figure out what's going to happen through past events or present events, right? It's kind of like, the weatherman, right? It's a forecast, all right? How? Because they know when certain things happen with the clouds and certain temperatures occurs, they can deduce that it's going to rain or it's going to snow or it's going to be a sunny day. That's what it can do. It can also deduce what will happen in the future, like the weatherman. So there's a lot of things that it can do, all right, based off of the idea that it creates ideas through the imagination. It can parse those ideas. It can create more ideas, and then it can make deductive reasonings based off of those ideas. This is going to be key for problem solving, risk management, and for almost everything in life. Is that that several capabilities? All right. So then Father Martin goes and talks about a little bit about cautioning our intellect and what causes us not to kind of use our intellect and what could be a problem with it. Okay, and this is very important here. It is well to note that our intellect function in such a way that we can never have two thoughts at the same time. This is important. We can't have two thoughts at the same time. All right. I can't, this idea of multitasking is not really capable in the brain. We can do something through muscle memory and still think, because our body and our ideas are very disconnected, but we can't have two thoughts. We can't be thinking at the same time. In fact, it's so funny. I was actually talking to a person yesterday on the phone. It was she was actually a customer of mine, and she was talking about a potential large deal going on. And so she was driving, and so she was talking to me, and every once in a while she'd be like, and then finally she said, "Oh, David, I'm actually driving home, and I can't speak well because I'm trying to concentrate on the traffic." And I started laughing. I said to her, "I totally understand. That happens to me all the time." This is exactly Father Martin's point. You can't have two thoughts at the same time. You can't be thinking about the traffic patterns and how these people are weaving in and out, because it was during a rush hour, as you're trying to have a conversation about this potential new deal that's going on. So you can't have two thoughts at the same time. And then Father Martin continues, if we are occupied in some thought, it will be impossible for us at the same time to be conscious of another distinct thought. This phenomenon is the basis of attention, which is nothing other than the application of the mind to a subject. So what he's saying here is paying attention. That's basically what he's saying. We have to pay attention to what we're reading, what we're doing. This is also very important, especially in the spiritual life, especially when we're praying. All right, I do the Liturgy of the Hours, and if I don't pay attention, one of the things I had to master was paying attention. I had a big problem, even when especially in high school. I did very well in high school, but I had a very big problem where my mind would wander. And a lot of times I would read a book and my mind would wander, and I would look at it and say, I just read this 100-page book, and I have no idea what this book ever said, because my mind was wandering. This is why we can watch a movie, but if our mind starts wandering, we'll never know what the movie was all about. Or if you're reading a book and your mind is wandering, you'll never know what it's all about. I later I didn't start focusing on this until I started a prayer life. Quite frankly, the Liturgy of the Hours. And the reason why was because a lot of times I started Liturgy of the Hours way before I became a tertiary. So a lot of times I started to do the Liturgy of the Hours, and I didn't do the Liturgy of the Hours, and I would go up and down because I was like, well, this isn't doing much for me. Or we could start getting dry and I would just forget about it. But it wasn't until I realized I need to focus on what I'm really praying and what I really need to say or praying. So because now I pay attention to those words, it has deeper meaning. So my ratio of paying attention to what I'm praying and what I'm saying in the Liturgy Hours is now about 80-20. Long time ago, it was probably 20-80, where my mind would just go in 6 million different ways. Maybe it was about work. Maybe it was about something else. But when we can focus, when we pay attention, okay, we can then harness those power of those prayers. All right, and also problem solving, risk management, everything that goes on. So paying attention is very, very important. Now, the way that we pay attention, all right, and not get distracted is right here. Here's the secret. This is from Father Marn. The custody of the senses, silence, and tranquility of spirit are a great help to the fostering of attention and the preservation of attention over a long period of time. For that reason, these things have great importance in practice. What he's saying is exactly my problems. I was not keeping custody of my senses, not being silenced, and not having tranquility. So what causes us not to pay attention are those three elements: silence, senses, and tranquility. I do have to disagree at least a little bit, not much, on the silence part, because because my tranquility and because I'm able to control my senses, you can even pray when our senses are being controlled. What I mean by that is, so when I do the Liturgy of the Hours, I can do them in a busy train. Ways that you can block the external senses, block what's going on, all right? Marines have been taught that way. When one of the things that you're taught is to focus. Because in combat, you've got lots of things occurring. You got, people dying and screaming. You've got explosions. Almost every part of your senses is being felt. You got pain. You got suffering. Sweat is going into your eyes. And now you're called to be a sniper to shoot one man. And you got to use every effort to focus and concentrate to shoot. Okay? So how do you do that? You have to be able to block your senses to focus. All right? So a little bit disagreeing, not disagreeing, but, in the silence part, in the sense that you can block your senses. And this is really what he's saying, actually, is that if we keep custody over senses and silence and tranquility, this is how we're going to maximize it. Tranquility is also key. All right? So if a Marine who is a sniper is not tranquil when he's trying to sight his enemy, he's going to have a difficult time pulling that trigger in a very calm manner. So tranquility is the same thing. When you're praying, if you're not tranquil, if you're not at peace, then you will not be able to pay attention, basically. So there is ways to keep yourself tranquil. So natural tranquility promotes this paying attention, which will then allow you to grow in spirituality. So we have to find peace, okay, in our lives. And I'll talk about that in the future, about how to bring tranquility into your lives, even in a chaotic environment. Military people know how to do that. There's this one training called HRT, High Risk Target Training in the Marines. And a lot of times, and what that means is you learn how to become a bodyguard. That's basically what it is. And I was going to take that training because at one time I was going to be a bodyguard for a general as a captain in the Marines. So, but one of the things that they do in that training is, as I'm trying to shoot with a pistol down range and hit my target, there's another Marine who's actually going to fire in right in front of me and shooting across from me. What that's simulating is a distraction because he's actually very close to me. The bullets are really firing very close to me, and the bullets are crossing me, going, and distracting me as I'm trying to focus on there. So there's a lot of focus that you can do to do that and bring tranquility into your body, even in a chaotic environment. All right. So the intellect can be very, very distracted because it can only focus on one thing at a time. If it's not focused on that item that you're trying to focus on because of the environment that you're in, then you're going to not understand what's going on. So to summarize, all right, Father Marn, the first thing we got to understand is we receive knowledge through our external senses. All right, that's where we get, and we call that sensory knowledge. What we read, what we see, what we touch, what we feel. all of these things come from sensory knowledge. We might even get ideas from the outside world, like, someone tells you, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? But that's still sensory knowledge. It isn't until we use the intellect and the imagination, where we call them phantasms, right? We create phantasms, these ideas through the imagination, and we call them abstract ideas, right? Because they're not concrete. And those abstract ideas produce what we call intellectual knowledge, right? So we got sensory knowledge and intellectual knowledge. The intellectual knowledge is far more superior and far better. This is where most people fail. They don't want to produce intellectual knowledge. Now, when we say intellectual knowledge, we are not talking about specifically the knowledge of the knowledge that is specifically Einstein knowledge, like scientific knowledge. We're just talking here simple knowledge here, simple conclusions in doing that. We store all of our knowledge, both sensitive and intellectual, in our memory. That's what we store it. Now, this is really weird because a lot of people have good memory or bad memory, all right? And so that also is an issue as well. I call that, when people have very bad memory, I call that evaporation rate. We actually call it, I term it here at Fairfax, because you'd be very surprised how fast people don't memorize things. But I think the reason why they don't memorize and why they have bad memory is because people are not using intellectual knowledge. They're not coming with intellectual knowledge. And because of that, they're trying to memorize the sensory knowledge. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this down in the future a little bit. That's why. So what when I say that they're really lacking memory or evaporation rate is they're really not understanding the intellectual knowledge. They're only getting sensory knowledge. And so they only memorize the sensory knowledge, and it's called rote memory. So the fourth thing is that the intellect can then process these sensitive intellectual knowledge and extrapolate that knowledge, right? That's what we can do, to make judgments. Judgments then make reasoning, and reasoning can expand to deductive reasoning, all right? So that's how the intellect works, in our process. So what does this all mean? Okay. And I'm hoping to do this very quickly, actually I might just wrap it up right here. And then we might have to go to, we're going to do this other episode and talk about problem solving and the ability to do risk management. So I'm going to wrap it up by saying this, all right? Just like, I was watching the 10 Commandments during the season of Lent, and it does a great picture of how the Egyptians physically enslaved the Jews, all right, in Egypt. But they also enslaved them spiritually. And that spiritual enslavement was that they made them do menial and process-oriented jobs. They weren't there to think. The thinkers were the Egyptians. But the Jews were just there to do this menial process. So they not only enslaved them physically, they also enslaved them intellectually. That's what they did. And that's what the modern world is basically doing as well. They're enslaving us intellectually through processes and systems and pigeoning us. And so one of the biggest things that we have to do is recognize the understanding of our intellect so we can set it free. Because there's a great potential we have in our intellect that we can use in our practical life, in our spiritual life, so that we can grow in holy success and become a saint. So the only way that we can get that raw knowledge or to tap into that raw power is by understanding the parts of the intellect and using the parts that are neglected. And the areas that are being neglected is the intellectual knowledge, meaning the ability to use our imagination to produce ideas from our sensory knowledge, and then being able to make judgments on those. All right, to produce reason, and then to create deductive reasoning. Those are the two elements that most people do not do. They rely a lot on other people to give them answers. And that also means spiritually. I don't know how many people rely on, again, I hate using Scott Hahn as always an example because I love him and he's a great man. But we rely on theologians to give us answers. That's what we rely on. And again, I'm not bashing theologians, but you're never going to embrace and you're never going to internalize theology and elevate to the higher good until you take ownership and deduce it yourself. That's the problem. Because if you only listen to external senses, knowledge, Scott Hahn, Father John Harding, or whoever it is, then you're just no better than what I call groupies. You're a groupie. And St. Paul talks about that. He talks about it and he says, are we the faith of a Peter? Are we the Peter groupie? Are we the Paul groupie? No, we are the Jesus groupie. That's what we are. And the only way that we can love and fulfill ourselves with Jesus is through intellective knowledge that we are producing ourselves through our sensory. Theologians are great to start with, to give us that sensory external ideas and images. But we got to use our intellectual knowledge and our imagination to produce intellectual knowledge. That's when we take it our own. All right? And that's where meditation is so important, because you cannot meditate without those two elements. Using our imagination to produce our own ideas and using our intellect to produce conclusions, deductive reasoning, to produce reasoning as well as judgments. You can't do that. That's why meditation needs those. That's why God gave us that, so we can meditate on the truths of the Catholic Church. But if you're just relying on theologians to give you the answers, to give you, whatever it is, and that's only giving you warm and fuzzies, and you're just becoming a groupie, okay? And God doesn't want groupies, all right? He wants us to be, fully in love with Him through our own reason and understanding through the intellect. So I apologize. We have to wrap it up. So the next episode, I really will go over problem solving. Problem solving is so important because we need to understand, how to solve our spiritual problems, our worldly problems, just problems in general. The other we're going to talk about as well is risk management. A lot of times how we can, defend ourselves with FUD from the devil is risk management. What is really risk and what isn't really risky, okay? So let's end it with a prayer in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, you gave us the power of the intellect. You gave us this power that makes us so much different than animals. The intellect that prays and loves you and understands who you are. As we pray that we may always use it to come closer to you, to unite our intellect with yours, so that we may unite our will with your will. As we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Cease at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect, how often do I use my intellect to meditate and reflect? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com. Join me next week as we discuss our continuation of the intellect and discuss about the problem solving as well as risk management and how we can improve our spiritual life, the enemies that prevent us from using our intellect, and how we can overcome them.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.